I'm James Hughes, bioethicist and resident techno-progressive.
And I'm Eisikovits, philosopher and resident Luddite.
And you're listening to Prosthetic Gods, an optimist and a grump on tech, a podcast where we explore the social, ethical, and political impacts of emerging technologies.
Good morning, Jay.
How are you, sir?
Good. What are we talking about?
Well, whether we're getting dumber, whether we're inevitably doomed to get dumber.
Yes, next episode.
But also about the big changes in the way that the human mind has been organized in relationship to our communication and information technologies. That's the
excellent. So the label of cognitive offloading,
right? Which I have in the past been more dismissive of, but the evidence has been rapidly accumulating. Various papers showing that cognitive offloading in relationship to AI is happening. So we need to talk about it. But let's define the question first.
Yes, please. So explain it to me like to an 8th grader. What is cognitive offloading? Why were you dismissive about it? Why, shockingly, are you now excited about it?
It's not so much that I'm excited about it, but I'm convinced that it's more pressing than I would have given. Okay, so cognitive offloading. We don't walk around trying to remember everything that we learn and experience. When we learn things, part of what we're learning is what we don't need to keep in our head and what we do need to keep in our head. It doesn't help to have all of your phone numbers in your life be recorded on your phone if you can't remember how to open your phone or access the phone numbers. So cognitive offloading, since we started literacy, whenever that was, 10,000 years ago, we have been trying to figure out what it means to be an educated and successful person and how much needs to be in the head and how much can be left outside the head. Now with AI, the question is not just knowledge and words and those, we now have the problem of machines which can do various of the thinking tasks for us, the synthesis, the research, the writing parts of our intellectual life. And the evidence is that the more that students or adults learn to rely on these tools, the more that their practice of these skills gets degraded. So the question is this qualitatively different from the kinds of cognitive offloading that we all practice already and that we consider essential to being an educated and successful person because you can't be burdened by all the knowledge all the time? Or is this, is this a bad portent for the future of the human race? I think that's the question.
Gotcha. So would it be fair to say that in some way the entire history of technology is the history of cognitive offloading?
Well, I mean, automation more broadly is learning to have machines do things for us instead of relying on human labor. And this is the cognitive version of that. And as I implied, I think it started with literacy. It's when we learned to download the contents of the human mind onto external storage media, and so that we wouldn't have to keep it all up there anymore. And as we'll discuss in terms of Ted Chiang, the part of the implication of that is that once you start to rely on the facticity or the veracity of what's written as opposed to oral traditions, that does change how people think and communicate and social structures and all kinds of things. The advent of literacy in the 17th century, 16th century, contributed to the political upheavals of Europe and so forth. So we know that there's a tremendous change as we go through these information technology changes. And the question is now, is this an infantilization of the human race that we're facing, or could it be a step change towards something greater like literacy was?
Yeah. So maybe let me just put a few examples on the table so they can serve as sort of coordinates on the map. So A spell checker would be an instance of cognitive offloading. You wouldn't need to expend cognitive energy on the route task of remembering how to spell words. A calculator would be an example of cognitive offloading. Again, the route task of arithmetic is taken off the table. A GPS device, you don't have to memorize how to get from point A to point B. Supposedly all of this kind of clears you up, right, for other tasks.
I think GPS is an interesting example because, I remember my first calculator in the 1960s, I think. I first got a simple calculator. And they've always been very reliable. You didn't go to your calculator and get a bad answer. But GPS, I remember one of my first uses of GPS ending up in the wrong city, being directed through lakes, things like that. And so there's a period of accommodation and trust.
Increase the cognitive load.
Well, whenever we start to learn how to use these new tools, we have to figure out how trustworthy they are. And that's a part of it. And if they're extremely trustworthy, like calculators, then yeah, we let it go pretty easily.
Right. And I guess one of the more, I was thinking about our conversation as I was driving back from dropping off my daughter at school this morning, because of course, you're bound to see on the highway somebody driving in a Tesla and being on their phone or, doing some other tasks while the car is driving itself, which I guess it's not supposed to do yet, or at least unsupervised. So that's a kind of aggressive example of cognitive offloading. And then you mentioned, whether what large language models can do for us is a qualitatively different kind of cognitive offloading. So I guess, to put one of the bigger questions on the table, you talked about de-skilling, namely, do we lose the skill that we've cognitively offloaded? Can we still navigate with GPS? Can we still spell with spell checkers, et cetera, et cetera? Mm-hmm. I guess the other sort of question, especially as I was looking at those Teslas, is what do you do with the time that you've saved? Is it like, oh, great, now I can scroll on Instagram more while the car is driving itself? So it's kind of interesting that there's a sort of almost like a non-technological, philosophical, moral question having to do with, all right, you have saved yourself some cognitive capacity.
But I think there's a continuing theme between you and I, which is I see all time savings as an opportunity that people won't necessarily use correctly. And you seem to think that all involuntary drudgery, including mental labor, is a virtue because it keeps us from the idle hands being devil's playthings.
Yeah, that's fair. That's fair. But if I'm, if I'm going to be more rigorous about it, we're not necessarily prepared for the amount of time saved that cognitive offloading devices give us. So, for example, if we do get society with a lot more leisure because of automation in the next 30 years, we will have been prepared for it by a massive regimen and distraction and, forgetting how to read and so on and so forth that, the previous use of technology has sort of conditioned us to. And so it is a question of, is there a sort of perfect storm between, on the one hand, how much free time we're going to have in theory and how badly ready we are for actually enjoying, marinating, benefiting from it because of our tech use.
Yeah, I think a parallel question that we've been talking about for a while is also whether LLMs could overcome the loneliness crisis by becoming our friends. And I see increasing discussion of that. And that's kind of the cognitive offloading of our friendship needs and capacities onto these things as well, which I think is an interesting and disturbing parallel that are we de-skilling our interpersonal communication skills by young boys spending half of their day on video games as opposed to actually hanging out with friends?
Are there things that we should resist resist offloading? Are there things that shouldn't be offloaded? We've had this discussion, for example, about grief bots. And, I know that you think that, they're a gimmick. I think that they're more serious, but the sort of question underlying it in some way is, should you offload grief? As you say, should you offload social relationships?
I'd say I never object to the questions that there could be pathological adaptations of these things. And in this case, that cognitive offloading could lead some people to become dumber and de-skilled in ways that they would have otherwise chosen not to. It's just that I see the opportunities. I think that most people will use them with agency and as they have previous things. Like we figured out how to teach kids about math and about calculators at the same time. And so we figured out an accommodation around that. And, with the case of a kid who spends all his time with computers and doesn't know how to talk to girls, maybe then there's some kind of solution to that, a software solution. You could say only certain kinds of computer systems should be interacting with kids, that socializing kids is a special job. And until you're 18, you should have these kinds of apps and not these others. And I think that's an interesting direction to head. And those, in China, Douyin, which is their version of TikTok, is full of educational stuff because that's what the censors say. None of this other crap that distracts people on TikTok in the West. We want you to be focused on education.
Yeah. I mean, if you sort of zoom out a little bit and take a philosophical view of this, so there's always going to be a de-skilling cost to just descriptively to cognitive offloading, because in some basic way, that's the point, that you decide certain skills are a waste of your cognitive capacity. And then you have your sort of Rousseauian romantic take on this, which is, all offloading makes us weaker and makes us forget, what we knew how to do, and reduces our capacity to deal. And then the point that you're raising is, number one, yes, but what's the payoff? Is the payoff worth the de-skilling? Is the payoff richer than the de-skilling? And I guess a point that we'll get into from discussing the Chiang story is what ways of life are lost and what ways of life are gained, what ways of looking at the world are lost, what ways of looking at the world are gained by the introduction of these de-skilling tools.
Right.
So should we briefly summarize the Ted Chiang story?
Yes, but let me just take a swipe at Black Mirror before we get into it, because
there we go.
This Ted Chiang story was written before the Black Mirror episode. I think in season 2, there's an episode about a guy in a world with the technology that we're going to be discussing here, a lifelogging technology, and it breaks up his marriage because of his obsession with previous conflicts that he and his wife have been involved in. Mm-hmm. And that has always, that's one of the examples of Black Mirror just being unrelentingly technophobic and Luddite. Yeah.
And that's my favorite show.
I know. But Truth of Fact and Fiction illustrates what we were talking about when we wrote our essay about Ted as a techno-realist, because he really presents a more balanced understanding, a more anthropological one. But go ahead, let's get into it.
And it's funny because he does actually talk about the impact of this technology on a marriage. So Ted Chiang is an illustrious science fiction writer. If you want to read the most wonderful assessment of his work, Jay and I will link our essay in the show notes. The Truth of Fact, the Truth of Feeling is a long short story / novella. And the premise is as following. There's 2 timelines, one in the future, one in the past. The future timeline includes a memory enhancement technology called ReMem, which features a retinal camera that will record all of your perceptions and make them searchable, such that instead of going to your iPhoto library or your Google Pics library, what you would do is say, last Thanksgiving, who was at the dinner and what did we talk about? And it would bring up a brief video or stills of that if you wanted. Or when I was arguing with Jay in the previous episode, did he really say blah, blah, blah? Or did I really say blah, blah, blah? And you can go back to look at that. And there's a journalist who's the protagonist of this timeline. He's writing a story about this kind of technology, and he is looking at what it does to people's lives. So he, looks at one example of like a couple fighting, and can they go back to the moment in which they had a fight and figure out exactly who said what to whom, and does this help their relationship or damage it? But a more interesting example that he uses is that in a conversation with his daughter, he remembers that she said something extremely hurtful to him years ago, and that changed the nature of their relationship and created a rift between them. But then when this technology, that incident happened before the technology was introduced, but when the technology is introduced, they can go back, and it actually turns out that his memory was faulty, and he was the one who said
that incident happened when she had the device and he didn't.
Right.
So he can go back and review what actually happened through her eyes. Yeah.
Right. And it turns out that actually the way he remembered things was incorrect, and he was the one who said the offensive thing. So that's one timeline. And then the other timeline, interestingly, tells the story of Djengi, who's a young member of a tribal society and who is introduced by a missionary to writing, and replaces his culture's oral form of communication and storytelling with, more precise, or at least what he thinks is more precise, more analytic, and more cold ways of communicating and recording events, and involves his reflections on his relationship with his elders, while the elders are still versed in storytelling, and he is now a scribe. And so both cases, it's a sort of historic and future-oriented forms of cognitive offloading and recording, and the way they change people's relationships and the way they change their perception of reality. Is that fair?
Yeah. And I would just want to say that I also have some personal connection to the Djengi story, because when I was working in Sri Lanka, one of the things I worked on was an assessment of extrajudicial dispute resolution councils that the nonprofit organization I was working for had set up in villages, where village chieftains basically would oversee disputes between husbands and wives principally, but other kinds of disputes, without any of the legal, nobody involved was a lawyer. And so it was very similar to Djengi's situation, in that there was the traditional village hierarchy, the guy that is above him, who says, look, there's the absolute truth, and then there's the truth according to us right now, the truth that works for us. Yeah. And that jarring disconnect between sometimes the truth that works for us right now is not the actual truth. I think that's a very foreign concept in Western jurisprudence because of literacy, precisely the fact that we have facticity now. Right.
So forensic truth and evidence depend on information being written down and staying. Mm-hmm. And if you don't necessarily have information being written down and staying, your idea of forensic truth becomes destabilized. Djengi also realizes that it was only after he started practicing writing that he noticed that people talk in words for the first time. So that's also interesting. So this idea of your perception of the units, as it were, of experience are influenced by the technology that you have. So he started thinking about communication in terms of words and in terms of the kind of splitting up and parsing out of sentences into words after and not before he had writing. And so he was...
I think Ted could have introduced a little bit more cognitive science there, because we learn words first, but then we learn to recognize whole parts of sentences. You know, our capacity for literacy grows as we recognize bigger and bigger blocks.
Right, but the claim seemed to be that there are no words without writing. There's just a kind of, you know, I don't know what you would even call it, but a narrative.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of the question,
a broader narrative,
is oral language, oral communication. Did the symbol manipulation that was required for us to come up with oral communication, was all the things that we're talking about in written communication already implicit in that? I know that there's some anarcho-primitivists who have argued that as soon as we started to use symbols, that was when we lost it. So
there you go. But what what this is illustrative of, I think, in a nice way, is the first point that we were making earlier, that cognitive offloading one way or another. So the Djengi story in particular is powerful on this. Cognitive offloading in one way or another does result in a loss of a way of life. Now, so the more literacy you have, I mean, even Plato was saying this as far back as the Republic, the more literacy you have, probably you are going to lose oral culture. So essentially, you know, writing kills Homeric storytelling. We only have Homeric storytelling because we wrote it down, but
but don't skip over that. We still have Homeric stories because we wrote them down, right? So
we do, but the kind of culture that was written down, where, you know, Odysseus is sort of wandering around and sitting, you know, with different people telling their stories around the campfire and becoming friends as a result, is slowly disappearing. Like storytelling from a way of life turned into a kind of niche thing that you almost a sort of fetishistic little activity that people, you know, are hired for or do on the side. But as a way of life, oral storytelling has disappeared. I think that's, you know, and you gained Homer, Plato, Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, etc., etc., etc. But you did lose something.
I mean, the Buddhist scriptures are the largest scriptures in the world, partly because for the first 500 years, they were all sung as songs. And so they're incredibly repetitive and structured as the stanzas of songs. And because monks couldn't remember all the songs, then different temples would be focused on different theological points or philosophical points on the basis of which songs they could remember. So, you know, then we wrote it all down, and then you could be a Buddhist scholar and study all the things that people had been saying.
Yeah.
I don't see this as that traumatic or, you know, tragic transition. But
yeah, I mean, when all of Djengi's friends and relatives are going to learn how to read and write, the way of life that had to do with the elders communicating by storytelling orally and transmitting the tradition from one to another was going to disappear. Maybe it's inevitable, maybe cost-benefit wise it's a good thing, maybe not, but...
Well, the specific example in the story is that his boss thinks, or his clan leader thinks that that they should tell the story that they're related to one tribe versus another, or that there are a certain set of historical lineages, genealogies. And it turns out that 40 years before, the missionaries had recorded an oral storytelling that had said that it was a different way.
Yeah, and it wasn't true.
It wasn't
factually.
Right. Well, what we know about genealogy is that both could be true or both could be not true. Who knows?
Right.
You know, there's one of my favorite responses to genealogy after I spent a good 15 years diligently trying to pursue my own was that the rate of misattributed paternity in genealogical records means that you really don't know who your ancestors were. At 40 years, you could probably figure it out, but 400 years, no way.
Yeah, but the elders were saying to Djengi that, you know, the function of communication as they understood it wasn't to figure out the truth. It was to serve the current needs of the community and keep it together and make sure that it keeps transmitting its traditions to the next generation. regardless of whether they, had anything to do with the truth of fact, as Chiang calls it.
Don't you think there's a value to the truth of fact? I mean, if this is in fact the big philosophical change that we made once we wrote things down, which I don't think it did. I mean, we have an administration where you can present the fact that yesterday you said this, and then the next day you did this, and they just say, so what?
You're saying we're going back to oral storytelling.
Right, exactly.
Well, I mean, I think it's an interesting example. I mean, yes, there's a value to the truth of fact. I think techno-progressives tend to underestimate the loss. And I don't think you can make the techno-progressive case if you don't take the loss seriously and argue that it was worth it. So that's a sort of general complaint I have. If I fast forward, from the Genghis story to large language models, the updated version is something like, in the history of technology, whenever a machine learned to do something very well that a human being could do, that activity has stopped being a major mainstream human activity. So we don't really need to. People can't spell anymore, and it's fine, and people are not very good at arithmetic anymore, and that's fine, because it's just not needed. And I think there is no way around the fact that people will not be writing anymore. It's not there yet, but 10 years from now, 5 years from now, it will be purely a kind of artistic form of expression, rather than a mainstream way of learning how to think, because machines are going to be able to do it. So if the historical trajectory holds, people will stop writing. It will no longer be a tool for us to teach students critical thinking, etc. Yes, there'll be a transition period when people co-write with large language models, but I don't think that's going to last.
One of the effects of automation is that, like, if you go from the random Paleolithic human being handed a plow and say, go plow this field, some of them are going to do a good job and some a bad job. But once you introduce oxen, then even a weak and lazy person can stand behind an oxen and plow a field. So one of the things that we're going to see, and we're already seeing with these LLM tools, is that the average person will probably have an improvement in the quality of their output, even if there is a degradation of skills, and that we see something on the order of a doubling of productivity for people who become proficient in the use of these tools. Once they stop using the tool and have become dependent on the tool, yes, they're like half a person, right? It's like a centaur can run faster than a human, but you cut a centaur in half and they don't run at all. So I think that's the dilemma that we're in, is that if we figure out how to do this right, we will all be able to do things better than the average person could have. And there will be some diminution of the average person's interest or their willingness to learn those skills, but still, on average, the productivity of society and the average person's efficacy in the world will improve.
Yeah. Efficacy, I mean, I guess in some ways efficacy compared to what? Efficacy based on what standard?
Well, you tell your kids, write thank you letters for every present you give. I have never been good about that. Having a superego, an electronic superego that either looks over my shoulder and nudges me to do it, or that does it on my behalf, that would be an improvement in my moral efficacy in the world. But
yeah,
most of the efforts, of course, are going into making us better consumers and workers. But I think we can have a broader imagination than that.
Yeah. I mean, I think one thing that I really liked about the Chiang story is that on the one hand, he really thinks that de-skilling is real, and he's very much alive to the kind of antisocial potential of these technologies. So again, a married couple who would go back to the moment in which they argue, and one could prove to the other what exactly they said, that would not be good for the marriage. That, in fact, inability to forget your memories is a condition for forgiving some of the transgressions that we make against each other, and a technology like Remem that gives you perfect recall would make it always harder to forget and therefore harder to move on. from insult. But on the other side,
I've been with my wife for 45 years. Have you never been in the situation where you thought something was one way and she thought it was another way? You had an argument about it and it turned out you were wrong. I have been in that situation, and that's the end of the argument because I was wrong. Right.
Yeah.
I may still be butthurt about it, but I was wrong. So is this the dilemma? The dilemma is that we're suddenly going to discover the truth about who said what or who did what at a particular point.
Well, there would be a way of proving that you are right or wrong. And maybe the constructive ambiguity is what ends arguments right now.
I think the stronger argument is the ability to forget past arguments is important. I agree with that. If you can constantly replay the worst things that someone ever said to you, it's going to be hard to maintain a relationship. But we might adapt to that as well. It's not like we don't have voicemail recordings and home videos. My wife once put together a home video for her artwork of our kids fighting, and it was cute because they were little, but it was a recording of them having an argument. So I don't think that it's that different. I think we're already in the situation where facts sometimes are inconvenient for the misremembering that we do, that we know that we do. And we know that that's the case. And the more we could bring our misremembering into sync with actual reality, probably the saner we'll be. That's my optimism.
Yeah. Let me run a thought by you. Now, so there are important tools for cognitive offloading that we have now. Large language models are already here, and they're one of them. AI agents coming and already here are going to take over a lot of tasks, self-driving cars, etc. So there seems to be an acceleration in our capacities for cognitive offloading, and those come with de-skilling. And here we have to do the cost-benefit analysis that we've been talking about. One interesting thing that I think is happening in parallel is that there's a lot of de-skilling going around from technology that is not the result of cognitive offloading. So, for example, spending a great deal of time on kind of hyper versions of social media like TikTok and Snapchat are degrading people's ability to read and focus and stay on task with, a larger piece of text or with a 15-minute lecture or something like that. So there seems to be a weird ratio a little bit. Part of what I'm noticing, and as I'm saying this, I'm realizing that I'm sounding more like you than I'd like to.
That's okay. But we've already confessed that we're probably converging over time. But
that actually a lot of de-skilling is happening not as the result of cognitive offloading, but as the result of shitty technology.
I think that's partly true. Let me make a confession. I, have been an information addict, ADD information addict since the get-go, and have a very conscious habits of, attracting information through different sources. But because I try to maximize my exposure to the different things that are happening in the world, I have an attraction to the shorter media versus the longer. So I have, 400 podcasts at any one time lined up in my to listen to next podcast filter. But I put the shorter ones at the top because I think, I'll get through 5 topics by listening to these things instead of these 2-hour things down below.
Yeah.
Now, does that mean that I'm cognitively lazy or that I've just made the assumption that, there's a 2-hour podcast about cognitive offloading I could listen to or a 30-minute one, and the 30-minute one will probably give me what I need. And then I can go on and listen to other 30-minute podcasts about everything else. So, I'm not saying that, scrolling TikTok is cognitive optimization for being a well-informed citizen, but I think that the tendency towards people saying maybe reading, the latest 500-page book is not going to give me as much as asking ChatGPT for a summary of that 500-page book or a 20-minute podcast about that 500-page book.
Yeah. No, I guess my point was more simple. It was that most of our de-skilling, most of the instances in which we lose important abilities, I'm not sure come from technologies of cognitive offloading just so much as they come from completely useless technologies. So TikTok, I'm not seeing as a, it's essentially a attention monopolization technology.
Yeah.
It's profoundly de-skilling because it destroys attention, or TikTok as a category. I don't want to, sound like the old man screaming at the TV. There's a lot of de-skilling happening there with no offloading benefit, as far as I can tell.
Well, I use these social media platforms more than I should, and including TikTok. I haven't been a TikTok creator. I've made 3 TikToks, but I have perused TikTok on a regular basis since last October or something, when they were talking about shutting it down. And there is an active political resistance culture on TikTok. You hear, yesterday when I was on TikTok, I got video after video about, if you are an American citizen coming back into the United States from abroad, here are the things that you need to think about, because they could take your phone and download all of its contents, and try to determine if you're an enemy of the regime. And I wasn't seeing that on Instagram, and I wasn't seeing that on Facebook, and I wasn't seeing that on Twitter. So I think every social media platform has its own ecosystem of ideas. Now, most of TikTok, I agree.
Chinese Communist Party is going to save us from fascism?
Well, yeah, I thought about that. Am I only seeing this here because the CCP really wants me to be freaked out? It's like, come to China, you'll be free here. But maybe. But that's another. But this is part of our skills, is understanding the world, right, and where all this information is coming from, and that's another thing that I think that these tools could help us with.
So, is there an argument though for you that social media has a cognitive offloading role? So the case study that you're using now is that you learn about potential political threats that you wouldn't have known about. It would have taken you more time to figure out otherwise.
I'm not going to go to the bank on that one, but I would say that I think every communication technology serves a purpose. It's not as if people in the past weren't interested in fashion and celebrities and popular culture, all the things that fill up people's time on social media that you might not think are illuminating. But they also slip in politics and discussion of current affairs, and I see a lot of that in TikTok and in the other platforms. And I think that's my general point, is that the Luddite critique tends to dismiss the agency of human beings. Oh, if we gave you universal basic income and more leisure time, you just waste it by spending all your time on TikTok and TV, and so really you should stick to that 9-to-5 job in the office, or whatever this dismissiveness about human agency is. Yes, people have to figure out how to use social media in ways that don't make them depressed and isolated and lonely. And then depressed and isolated and lonely people use social media a lot. And so this is something we have to figure out. But we don't figure it out by saying people should stop talking to each other except face to face. That's not the path forward.
I guess the more fair argument that I'm making is that social media actually seems to be a technological example where the cost benefit between the amount of cognitive offloading that happens and the amount of de-skilling that happens is actually not worth it most of the time.
And the de-skilling you're talking about is the de-skilling of being able to talk to other people face to face?
Being able to talk to other people face to face, being able to stay on task attention-wise, being able to read a book, being able to understand complicated arguments that take 20 minutes to expound, etc., etc. Literacy in the functional rather than in the literal sense.
Book reading hasn't really gone away, but it's never been as popular as people in academia like to think it was, right? The majority, it was only 5% of the population that went to university or college before World War II, and then we expanded the access to higher education, and then
people's attention spans have crashed. I mean, it's not a super complicated point.
Well,
as the result of spending a lot of time on social media, I think that's pretty well established.
Yes, I think the evidence does support the idea that the pace of our modern life means that we have shorter attention spans. The question, my TLDR approach to the world of media is, I don't think I'm a dumber person for prioritizing brief and concise expositions of news to reading, spending 2 hours every morning reading every article in the New York Times or whatever.
Yeah. On that, actually, let me try this out on you. There's actually an argument to be made that technology results in cognitive overloading rather than cognitive offloading. And here's what I mean. So I love audiobooks, and I love podcasts, as you know, and I'm an avid consumer of both. But what quite often happens that audiobooks let me do is that I can listen to an audiobook while I'm driving or while I'm loading the dishwasher or folding laundry and so on and so forth. And then I'm doing more than I was doing before. And when I was younger, I used to love that. I felt that that was almost like a superpower. I'd get a lot of books read. Now I feel it makes me more tired. And so the cognitive load actually increases because of a technological capacity rather than decreases. And a variation on the same kind of point is I can learn now enough about a topic or a good amount by listening to a couple of podcasts, having a couple of conversations with Claude or ChatGPT about it or what have you. But the result seems to be that I get sort of flooded more quickly, if that makes sense, right? I can do in an hour what used to take a day, and then, my meat brain explodes. Mm-hmm. What do you think about that?
And so what's your solution? You live in this world.
This is a descriptive rather than a normative point, which is that the frame of cognitive offloading, I think, is too limited to what actually happens. I think there's as much cognitive overloading that happens as cognitive offloading.
Sure. And I think, again, we can experience this, the trauma of future shock of being surrounded by, like, if you want to be a flat earther, you could find a well of flat earther subculture and science to go down. And you have to have the discernment tools to know what kinds of things to trust and what not, and which kinds of information to pay attention to and not. So yes, I think that is a disorienting feature of our modern world, and it's only going to get worse. And one of the things that I hope for is that these tools, just as ChatGPT may crash, or things like it will crash the search market, the market for search, because people will say, why go to try to filter through the top 20 hits on something when I could just ask ChatGPT and get a good enough answer? There'll be a simplification. We will use these tools to simplify our approach to the world in a way that makes sense for us cognitively. And I think we're already doing that, right?
Yeah. So let me ask you a future-oriented question. So Djingi started seeing the world in words after he was introduced to writing. His perception changed, his apparatus for interpreting what was going around him changed as a result of the introduction of the technology of writing. Since LLMs are in some ways the most significant technological innovations of the last 5 years or so, and their use is becoming ubiquitous, in what way do you think they're going to change the way we see the world? Like, what's going to be the Djingi moment there?
Well, I think one thing about them is that as kind of fuzzy snapshots of the internet, they have central tendencies of things. And so one of the ways that they have potentially to change the world is to shift people who are closer to the edges of normative reality or consensual reality closer to the center, right? If you ask it a question, was the moon landing real? It's not going to say no, and here's how you can prove it. It's going to say, yes, it was real. And so I think that has some benefit, except that there's also then a constriction of certain kinds of alternative thought, which could be problematic. We saw the restrictions that were attempted to be imposed on social media during COVID. Some of them were probably overly strict in terms of refusing to allow people to talk about the Wuhan lab leak theory and things like that. And so we don't want our new information architecture to be overly restrictive or to be pushing people in one direction or another. Then the converse is that people will begin to be sycophantically treated by these machines, and that they will have their own custom realities, and I don't want that either. So I think those are the two big kind of epistemic things I'm worried about. But I I have a nephew who does not have he works in fast food, and he's told me that he uses ChatGPT all the time. So I think ordinary people are already seeing the benefit of asking for decisions. Yesterday, I had a question about what kind of insurance my son should buy, and I went to deep research on Gemini, and I put in the specs about who my son was and where he lived and what kind of insurance he might need to buy, and it came back in 10 minutes with an excellent report on the whole thing. Now, I could have spent 2 hours reading about that topic and trying to figure it out for myself, but I got a great answer. So, those are examples of extension of my agency. And I knew how to do the research on that. And I've certainly done it before in the past, but I didn't need to. Right.
Yeah. No, but that's a great argument for cognitive offloading. That's a benefit without a gigantic cost. I guess part of what I have in mind as an answer to the same question is, I like to assign these one-page papers to my students where they have to write a longer draft and then generate a shorter final version. And the premise is that the process of writing and refining your writing and cutting out the bullshit is a process which helps you learn how to think in a precise and rigorous and a more critical way. And increasingly the large language models, I try to come up with tricks to make it harder to use them, but increasingly they're going to be able to use it. And so my sense is that critical thinking training, for example, is going to shift from writing arguments to writing queries. And writing a query is a different cognitive task altogether than writing an argument. It may in the end be a useful cognitive task. So writing a prompt or a question for the large language model, right? But that's interesting in and of itself. Again, this is a descriptive point. You probably know where I come down on it because I'm conservative in this way. But as a descriptive point, seeing the world via queries and prompts is different than seeing the world via argument. It's just it's a perceptual shift, just like Jijengi started noticing words and sentences and paragraphs and the communications of the speakers that he interacted with, whereas they were literally not there before, prior to the introduction of writing.
Okay, but let me rephrase what you just said. We may be moving into a future in which knowing what the right questions are is more important than believing that you already know what the right answers are.
Than being able to make an argument based on a question,
right,
and figuring your thought out.
Wouldn't we prefer students to come out of the educational process being really good at asking the right questions as opposed to making all the right arguments?
No. I mean, I would prefer for them to be able to do both. And my experience has been that there can be an intellectual laziness in asking clever questions, and that actually the process of developing your own ideas can only be done in developing them, namely in writing them out. I have so many brilliant ideas, believe me. All I need to do is to make the Trump hand movements to convince you that I have so many brilliant ideas. Right. 99 of them don't
you
survive.
And I, we have the best ideas. Yeah,
that's exactly. Yeah. 99% of them don't survive half an hour of writing because they're shitty ideas, actually. And so the process of writing them out is profoundly instructive for me. And I think the same would be true for many people writing poetry, and for your wife doing her art installations, and for people writing books, etc., etc. So no, I think that large language models are going to introduce this kind of shift from execution to ideation and description. I think that's a shitty shift overall. It will probably even itself out with time, but I think that's definitely going to involve a loss.
If the loss manifests in the world that in some tangible downside, then somebody will care about making sure that we don't exacerbate that. So what I'm thinking of, like doctors, the evidence is now that patient communications that are done by LLM are preferred by patients to actual doctors' communications or for clinicians until they discover that it's from an LLM. But the question is, if doctors could convince patients, look, you prefer that I do it this way with this LLM, and then they lose even what rudimentary skills they had at patient communication, is that a problem? I don't.
So are you making this kind of point that if a practice is genuinely cognitively and psychologically valuable for us, it will survive by some sort of internal survival force?
Well, in this case, if patients never say, even though it may be true that I like an LLM communication, I prefer you to do it, and give that feedback, then physicians who use these tools in ways that expand their capacity to do authentic communication will get that feedback, right? So I'm just thinking about, excuse me, I'm thinking about our communication with kids in education. It's like, we do want to tell kids there are certain skills you have to learn, and we don't want you to over rely on these tools. Maybe we need to restrict their access to certain kinds of tools and direct them towards other tools which will encourage the pedagogical process. But in the real world, the question is going to be, how are you held accountable for your behavior? If you're a worker in a workplace and you're being held accountable for certain key performance indicators of your work, and you hit those marks with LLMs, but you don't hit them without LLMs, that's a pretty important signal that you plus LLMs is the more productive way to do this. Even if you never learn those skills yourself, you know how to use the LLMs. I mean, I keep getting an ad in TikTok for a guy who's selling a 30-day, a 1-month course. Each day is teaching you about a different AI tool and how to make money with that AI tool. And it's like, maybe at the end of those 30 days, you would have learned, you wouldn't have learned how to do any of those things yourself, but you would have learned how to do it with 30 different tools.
Yeah, but I mean, you're the socialist. The performance markers are not based on what's good for human beings and what promotes a flourishing life. It's based on somebody's dumb interests. So yeah, we'll be able to be more productive with LLMs, but based on somebody else's criteria, and we will become shittier people.
Yeah, but again, that denies our agency. Yes, in a capitalist society where you're principally being pushed to be a better consumer and worker, those are the kinds of tools that they're pushing you towards. But I've also been wearing artificial intelligence on my wrist for 15 years. And what it tells me on a daily basis is, based on the history of these 30 different things that we know about your body over the last month. This is how much exercise we think you should do today. These are the step goals that you should have for your heart, et cetera, et cetera. It measures my daily stress. It advises me to when to take a breast, So I think the idea that LLMs or that AI in general, or these communication tools, cannot be used to also give us signals about whether we're doing things right or wrong is bad. I'll give you another example. The eHarmony director has suggested, and it's not clear how serious it is at this point, but that she thinks that things should move towards you having a dating bot and everybody else having a dating bot in these things. And if you swipe left on each other, you first send your bots to have a high-speed, date to determine your compatibility. Now, that seems like it could de-skill the capacity for learning how to be a first date. But at the same time, we have LLMs that boys in particular have been attracted to, which are dating simulators, how to have a first date conversation, right? So you have your bots do the should we have a first date, and then you have done your dating simulator, and then when you get to that date, you have some easy icebreakers or whatever it is that you need on a first date. I haven't been on a first date yet, but
this is why I don't want technology that disrupts mortality. I do not want to be around in this world.
Well, you're going to have to. I'm afraid serial monogamy is the best possible option in that future.
Oh man.
So, okay, what am I really concerned about with this future? I'm concerned about it contributing to class stratification. That there has been a concern about work automation in general, that highly sophisticated cognitive skills will continue to be prioritized in the labor market, and that the people who hold on to human jobs will either have those kinds of skills or the things that even robots that are so physical and demanding that even robots can't do them yet, or something like that. And that this kind of de-skilling, intellectual de-skilling, which we could see some people quite eager to adopt, it's like, oh, thank God I never have to think about that again, could mean a cognitive inequality in our society. I am concerned about that. And so I think that these are important questions, but that they can be designed, that they can be partly remediated by thinking about how we educate kids, what kinds of tools they should be given, what kind of pedagogy they should be exposed to through these tools.
Yeah.
I don't know what to do about adults, because I don't think any restriction on how adults use social media or consume information is really attractive. But
yeah, no, that's fair. We were going to introduce a brand new feature of our podcast today.
Billionaires behaving badly.
Billionaires behaving badly, BBB, which is not the Bureau for Better Business or Better Business Bureau, but something else. So what billionaires behaving badly do we want to talk about?
Well, there is this there's so many opportunities these days, but the OpenAI et al., I think it's more than just OpenAI, Meta and others, who have been using their new access to the Trump administration to lobby for a formal statement from the Trump administration, and then presumably some kind of legislation and FTC and FCC policies that would allow and not penalize LLM makers from using copyrighted information in their in the generation of their models. And the recent news that Meta had consumed, 30 plus million illegally downloaded books as a part of their training data certainly added some fuel to this debate. OpenAI's argument about this, or Sam Altman's argument, has been that if this was found to be illegal, the use of copyrighted materials, Gemini was trained on YouTube videos without clear consent. There's all kinds of examples, that it would mean that all the extant models, except the Chinese ones, would be considered illegal or have to have some kind of remediation to pay the people that they wronged. Now, my position on this has been that if I can read books and things on the internet and write things informed by them, that I have not violated their copyright, and that was the express intent of creating those things in the first place, to influence the world. And that when an LLM does it at scale, like a search engine, they haven't violated your copyright. They unless they spit back out a copy of your article or book or painting, in which case, yes, that's a violation of copyright. But that's not what they're doing.
No, and unlike you, who wants to converse with the great ideas, the point of the companies making LLM is to make a lot of money rather than to influence the intellectual climate of the world. I mean, zooming out a little bit before we get back to Sam Altman here, all of these intellectual giants and great moral exemplars like Altman and Bezos and Zuckerberg have identified an opportunity where the Trump administration genuinely does not care about limiting AI. The opposite, they think that progress is going to be made by unlimiting it, and are trying to, squeeze this as much as they possibly can in the next 4 years, because they've identified, an opportunity that will likely not recur. So, Altman is saying, oh my God, let's have all copyright count as fair use, or let's have all of our scraping of the entire internet count as fair use and not be protected by copyright, because otherwise we'll lose the AI war to the Chinese, who don't give a damn about copyright in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
That's, I don't know. I can't help but think that that's profoundly cynical.
Well, it's kind of like the argument that, should we try to figure out exactly whose ancestors built X and go back and compensate them fairly for the building of X? Or should we acknowledge that a great number of our ancestors were involved in the building of X, and that therefore we have collective obligations to each other on the basis of this shared debt? I think there is a shared debt, that they have used the product of all human beings and through all of history. All the words that we ever said to each other were put into these things, and that as a consequence, that their commoditization, their monetization of it owes society something on that basis. Now, there's a similar situation with LexisNexis. LexisNexis didn't write any of the things that they have in their database. What they charge you for access to is their classification schema, right? So the question has always been, how is it that you get to commoditize the access to public records, which is law, right? That should not be permitted. You should have a public obligation to make access to the law free, or freer than you do. I think that that's probably the obligation on the part of these companies, that they, the use of explicitly stolen material is, I think, probably in a different category. Some Meta's Llama is probably in deeper trouble than some of these other models, but I'm sure we'll find explicitly stolen material in other places as well.
Yeah. So the argument is that, trying to think from Sam Altman's perspective, the kind of argument would be, if you want ChatGPT to be good at doing, philosophy, good at doing literature, or good at, being a business consultant, you want to have access to all of the literature on these things online. And the more it has access to, the better it will be. I guess I just don't want it to be good at those things.
Right. Yeah. Well, that's a different kind of complaint, isn't it? This week it became especially interesting, I think, because Hayao Miyazaki, the guy behind Studio Ghibli, he has always been a militant opponent of the automation of animation. But one of the image makers, I forget which one, came out with the Studio Ghibli adaptation, and you could basically say, show me Trump fighting with Angela Merkel and the Studio Ghibli style. And so all these Studio Ghibli, even the White House put out a Studio Ghibli. Now, can you copyright a style like that? A writing style or an artistic style? I think those are interesting questions. And we've had those kind of questions for a long time. People tried to patent the idea of a spreadsheet. And thank God we didn't get that patented, because we never have any competition in spreadsheets again. I think the other larger dimension of this debate is that a lot of these copyright things, the World Intellectual Property Organization, WIPO, was a spin-off of the World Trade Organization and the attempt to create transnational trade protections for intellectual property. And China has always been a huge scofflaw of these things, although they've gotten more serious as they got integrated into the world economy. And they began to have now intellectual property of their own, which they may want to protect through these mechanisms. So one of the challenges of DeepSeek, and now of the models that Tencent and Alibaba and the others are coming out with, which are one step behind, if at all, the Western models, is that they are 1% of the cost, and open source, whatever that means, and they seem to be trained off of these models, right? So the fact that if we were to decide, Gemini, you have to build a whole new Gemini and a whole new ChatGPT that doesn't use any of these copyrighted materials. And Adobe actually has an image generator that they built entirely off of images that they owned or that were clearly public source. So there are companies that are attempting to sell you ethically sourced AI, and Adobe is an example of that. But these DeepSeek and other models from China, they probably were trained of distillations, is what they call it. They were probably had some distillation from the Western models. So they're already benefiting from the fact that we stole our own stuff, and then they're stealing it and distilling it and then selling it back to us for pennies on the dollar. So I don't think that we're going to get away from a future in which everything that's ever been on the internet, legal or illegal, is going to be represented in these models.
So it sounds like there's a good chance that we'll lose the AI race to the Chinese anyway, open access or no open access. That being said, I really, the idea that Sam Altman and Zuckerberg and Bezos care about more lax intellectual property laws because they want to make sure that AI stays under democratic control is ludicrous to me. I think, they care about democratic control of AI about as much as the Trump administration cares about free speech. I think they care about power. They think they have identified an opportunity to increase their power, and they're going for it as in a full-throated way as they can.
I mean, last month, Sam Altman wanted to charge $200 a month to use their top model. And then almost immediately the Chinese said, oh, well, how about pennies a month? So I understand why he's mad. And I understand, just like the UAW getting on board with Trump's auto tariffs right now. It's like, Jesus, do you not recognize the enemy when he's right there in front of you? But I understand why the UAW wants tariffs on Japanese automobiles, although it's completely stupid in this globally interpenetrated economy. And I understand why Sam Altman would like more favors for OpenAI and less for Chinese AI. I think I downloaded...
Yeah, because $200 a month really democratizes the use of AI models.
I mean, clearly what Sam was aiming that towards is, hey, you think you can automate some of your workforce, member of your team, you're not paying them $200 a month, pay us $200 a month and we'll automate their work.
Yep. Well, all right, sir. We've had our rant. See, the whole point of the billionaires behaving badly segment is to sort of condition you in ranting, because I feel that I haven't done a good enough job in that.
It's funny. I spent the last year in terror of the political situation that I thought was unfolding, and now that it's here, I'm finding myself slightly more energized about being the anti-resistance rebel that I've always wanted myself to be, right? It's like, how much science fiction did I read about the lone hacker pitted against the authoritarian state?
Well, I'm just tending to my own garden as usual.
Well, that's because of your middle-class privilege.
There you go. Exactly. All right, sir.
Okay.
See you soon.
Talk to you soon.